ancient Maya city of Tikal. Probably many of you know of this site. It's been studied for decades, even centuries. Scholars have focused on the splendid architecture, the ceramics, the jade masks, and all the other material culture that's been found there. What hasn't happened at Tikal is there hasn't been a comprehensive study of the resource base of this major Maya city, and I'm going to be talking about that today. In particular, I'm going to be talking about the forest resources. I'm going to be talking about the agricultural activities and also about the water resources. Tikal is located, as we've already seen, Tikal is located in the Petén in the northern part of Guatemala. And one of the reasons that Tikal is where it is, many people look at this and they see this big city in the middle of nowhere. And one of the reasons it was here is that you can see like there are a number of rivers come up towards the central plateau here, and then other rivers, these rivers come from the Caribbean, and then other rivers lead down into the Gulf of Mexico. So during the late Classic period, Tikal was sort of the nexus of trade activity across the isthmus and was able to prosper because of that trade. So I'm going to be talking about Tikal today, but also Tikal in reference to Saran, which has already been mentioned. And Saran is such a valuable site because we know so much about the agriculture there. This is an aerial view of Tikal, and this shows the Great Plaza with, this is Temple number 1 here, this is Temple 2, this is the northern Acropolis. Over here we have a huge palace complex, there are ball courts here, all of the mainstays of great Maya cities. Some people think of Tikal as the capital of the ancient Maya realm. And indeed, it's a splendid place. Try to imagine what this might have been like during late Classic times, that everything you see here was covered with plaster and then painted. And just try to imagine the enormous maintenance costs of having a center with that kind of decoration. While all that decoration was happening, the population of Tikal was growing dramatically, and during the late Classic period, which began about AD 500-600, and at Tikal ended about AD 870, there was a dramatic population rise. And one of the things of debate at Tikal is what was the population there? And you can see this is from Pat Colbert's work, and you can see that there's a discussion about the size of the population during the late Classic period. Some people have suggested that there were about 40 to 45,000 people. Others have suggested 62,000, yet others say 80,000, and even one author suggested 250,000 people at Tikal, which is truly remarkable. And I'll be addressing this issue in a moment, that really none of those estimates were possible. They just didn't have a resource base for any of these except for perhaps 40 to 45,000. Well, what's also interesting, what's instructive about this graph is that there's a precipitous decline in population about in the 9th century, right around 870, 850 or so. There's a precipitous decline in the population, and the city was abandoned. And this is one of the mysteries of the late Classic Maya. What happened at Tikal? And hopefully this research study I'm going to talk about will help to explain what happened to the late Classic Maya. So we're looking at the resource base of the late Classic Maya. And to do that, we have to define the area from which the Maya could extract their resources. And so we created what's called a Borough diagram. And this is a set of mathematical formulas designed to compare one site to its neighbors. And in this Baroni diagram, we have outlined the resources that could have been available to the people of Tikal. Now, this area is sort of in blue-green. This is the late Classic period, and this defines the area from which the people of Tikal could have extracted their food and their forest resources. This yellow area refers to the pre-Classic area, so ignore that for now. This red area is very important because this area was the built environment of Tikal, if you will. And this area we know of very well because this has been mapped by archaeologists. So this is a very firm line of evidence here. And then this black square in the middle, that is a 9 square kilometer area that some people call the ceremonial core. This was mapped by the University of Pennsylvania back in the 50s and 60s. And another thing about this map is that the green areas are upland forest, what we think of when we look at tropical forest, and then these areas that are kind of purplish. This is the satellite image. These areas that are kind of purplish, these represent the bajos, or the wetland forests. So we surveyed all of these areas. We wanted to get an idea of what the modern forest was like so that we could use this information to project into the past. After Tikal was abandoned or at least mostly abandoned, in the 9th century, the forest has regrown. And there's been very little disturbance in this area, and it's been a protected park. So it's a very good area to do a forest inventory study. So we measured the forest. We measured about 6 hectares of forest. We measured diameter at breast height. We measured the height of the trees. And also we recorded the species and collected voucher specimens as well. Here we are in the upland forest. This is Kim Thompson, my co-author and graduate student who just finished her PhD at Cincinnati, and a couple of other folks from Guatemala. Here we are measuring the upland forest. We also measured in the bajos. To get an idea of what the environment was like in the past, we cored the reservoirs, we cored the aguadas, and also some lakes in the area to try to look at the pollen from the past, to try to get an idea of what the extent of the forest might have been in the past. Now, I've presented on this topic before, so I'm not going to go into the details of that, but the upshot of it all, the conclusions that we had in terms of wood use in the past, it appears from the pollen evidence combined with the modern forest biomass estimates, a population of 45,000 would have required about 42 million kilograms per year of fuel. And you know, it's interesting, if you read in the papers today, I mean, you pick up the business section, almost any time there's a story about fuel use, about natural gas, about oil, about coal, or something like that. But you could pick up almost any treatise on the Maya, and you never see anything about their fuel use. And their main fuel was wood. And it was something that was just as important to them as natural gas is to us. But it's something that's not part of the conversation. But nevertheless, it was very important, especially for this reason here, because many of the foods that they consume, for example, beans, you can't eat beans if you don't cook them. And that's also true for maize to a lesser extent. And so firewood was an inexorable need and something that was required every day. Some other major uses were ceramics, I've already alluded to plaster production, and surprisingly, construction was a relatively small wood need that they had. But the overall wood need for a population, late Classic population, 45,000 would have been about 42 million. Now, what was available was about 39.2 million kilograms per year. And these numbers are not significantly different. But if you look at a population of 62,000, this number is quite large, and it is quite different than what was available. So for this reason and others, a population of 62,000 could not have been supported by the land at surrounding Tikal. Now we looked at thousands of plant remains here. We found ZMAs and all the other usual suspects, the corn, the beans, the squash, and we also found evidence for lots of tree fruits, and we have the wood of cacao demonstrating that they actually grew cacao at Tikal, and we found evidence for root crops. 3 species of root crops were being used at Tikal. Now we want to compare what we find at Tikal to what we find at Saran. And the reason we want to do that is because we know, we have learned a lot about Maya agriculture from Saran. And the reason is that this site was inundated by volcanic ash around AD 600, right at the beginning of the late Classic period. And the beauty of Saran is the plants are right there on the ground before the eruption occurred. So we know what plants the people at Saran were growing, and we also know how they were growing them. So Saran is very instructive, and I think it will help us interpret what we find at Tikal. One of the reasons this is a valid comparison is many of the plants that we find at Tikal were also found at Saran. Also, Saran and Tikal had the same kind of natural vegetation. So this comparison is valid in our estimation. Now this is household 1 that was pictured earlier, and this shows how this area was planted. And this is based on information found on the ground. So we found evidence for all of these plants at household 1. And what we see here is this household is surrounded by orchards, and then also we have household gardens here, where we have maize, beans, and squash, and we have root crops. And then all of this is surrounded by what must have been a very attractive orchard. Also at Saran we find casts of plants. Here we see maize and a manioc stem, or the archaeologists were able to create casts of plants. And we have very good evidence for manioc here. Now, this is our publication from 2012, and what we see here, this is the village of Saran, if you will. But then outside of the village, there were extensive areas of planted fields, or milpas, that were planted with maize and manioc. And this is probably where most of the calories came from for the community of Saran. Now, using Saran as a model for Tikal, we look at the area in red here. This is the built environment. This would be analogous to the village of Saran. And it's interesting that the house compounds here are not really close together. There's space between all the Plazuela groups in this area here where the people lived in Tikal. So it's reasonable to conclude that they must have grown orchards and household gardens just the way they did at Saran. Outside of this red area, there were plots of woodlots, and then there were also open areas that were used for agriculture, probably in a short fallow cycle, like there was enough land there for 1 year of planting with 3 years of fallow, or as has been demonstrated by other studies in this area, they had 3 years of planting followed by 5 years of fallow. And so this same kind of system likely would have been employed at Tikal. Now the bajos, as I mentioned earlier, they were also important. This is a pollen profile from Aguada de Terminos. This is a small settlement that's out in the Bajo Santa Fe. Here we see evidence for Cana indica and CMAs, so they're planting root crops and CMAs out in the bajos. This is that settlement, and in addition to the pollen evidence from here, we also see evidence of terraces here. So they're using terraces to try to protect the soil. All right, so here's the breakdown of it. So this represents the upland areas that was forested, and and you can see this represents now a fairly small portion of the land here. So a lot of the land has been cleared when you get into the late Classic period. But this was enough land to support 40,000 to 45,000 people if this was forested. Over here, this little wedge here, this represents the built environment. This would have been covered with orchards and household gardens. This 7.4%, this was the part of the Bajo area that was cleared, and then these, I'm sorry, this is the part that was cleared, and this was cleared, and this is the part that was still remaining in forest. And this is the breakdown of how the populace of Tikal was able to feed itself and also provide all of the fuel that it needed. Now, another thing that was very important to the people of Tikal was their water resources. And this is from Vern Scarborough's work. What's interesting about Tikal is that this area was set up in a place where it's the wet and dry tropics. They're not near a lake, they're not near a river, and so they didn't have any consistent source of water. The reason they settled here in the first place was there were these springs here right around the Temple Reservoir. And eventually they built around those springs, they had all of these pavements, and they canted the pavements so that the water came into the springs, and ultimately they dammed off this little arroyo and created a series of reservoirs. And they continued that throughout the community, and they dammed up areas to impound water. Well, many of these areas of impoundment were used for drinking water purposes, but it appears that some of them were used for agriculture. I'm going to talk about this one here, Perdido, and the reason it's called Perdido, this is the Mundo Perdido, the lost world of the Maya, and all of the pavements there were canted into the Perdido Reservoir. And this is what the Perdido looks like. There was a canal that came down from the Mundo Perdido, and it drained into this reservoir. And one reason we think that this was used for agriculture is that it was never cleaned out. There was lots of artifactual waste in this reservoir, indicating that they didn't care to keep it clean because they weren't going to be drinking out of it. And most of the other reservoirs were kept clean, by contrast. Also, we find just below here, we did Delta 13C readings from a number of areas below the reservoir, and we found that there is enrichment in a number of areas, indicating that this could have been used as a maize field. And also, I think the most important, and this is really the smoking gun, frankly, that this area was used as a reservoir for irrigation was right around AD 485. Suddenly the soil changed. This is a soil pit from out in that in the Bajo that we have. We call it a pocket Bajo at 485. And then after 485, we have all of these laminations. And then suddenly this becomes an alluvial system. And what this represents is that this area was being periodically flooded for agriculture. So in summary, the agriculture at Tikal during the late Classic period looked something like this. There were home gardens and orchards around the house sites. That was about 165 square kilometers. There was intensive agriculture in fields, about 348 square kilometers. The Bajo margins were planted with maize and root crops. There were terraces to conserve soil, and there were reservoirs used for irrigation. I've talked about Perdido, but there are a number of other reservoirs that look like they could have been used for irrigation. So in conclusion, the agriculture system could support about 40,000 to 45,000 people. the upland areas, as well as the bajos, were being exploited. There was a very heavy demand on timber stocks. They cleared a lot of land, but managed intensively what land was left that was forested. And this may have actually had some negative impacts on the hydrologic cycle. And when the droughts came, and the droughts of the 9th century have been very well documented. So when those droughts came, the resilience of the Maya agriculture and forestry system, they were already at their carrying capacity. They were producing as much as they could produce. And then when the droughts came in the 9th century, they were suddenly unable to feed the large population. And because of that, the community collapsed. And this is, I believe, is a case of environmental overstretch, where they extended the carrying capacity of their land. And when climate change happened, perhaps anthropogenically induced, the Maya were no longer able to cope with changing circumstances. And environmental change ultimately did them in. Thank you very much. I want to thank also our many other investigators and our support mechanism foundations have been very helpful to us, very kind. And also the Tikal team that made all of this research possible. Thank you again. Do you have a question? Yes?
Yes. Dave, your pie chart shows forest and cultivated areas, built environment, as well as forest.
Mm-hmm.
Does that pie chart map onto the site itself, or there's only quantities? And related question, are these vastly cleared cultivated fields, or are they interspersed with some of the forest?
You're talking about this pie chart?
Correct.
This is something that's very definite. We know exactly where this is. Do we know exactly what part of this 30% was forested? No.
Yes, that's my question.
Yeah, we don't know exactly, like, okay, this area was forested in the past, and okay, this area was an open field in the past. Now, it might be possible to do, I'm sorry?
Some of that cultivated area have patches of forest or tree-like vegetation in it.
I mean, that's possible. But what we see, you know, we've looked at the plant remains from Tikal, and we've looked at many of the woods. And what's interesting about it is the woods that we've analyzed are very similar to the woods that are still there today. And it appears that they were managing for diversity. I mean, if you compare what the Maya were doing to what the Europeans are doing in Belize, for example, where mahogany was once a very common tree, and now it's a rare species, where they were going in and just picking out a few things, whereas the Maya seem to have been managing for diversity.
How can you discount they weren't having some fast-growing fuel woods? And I know these Mayans can carry things for many, many kilometers. Why weren't they bringing things for fuel wood from further distances, or perhaps growing fuel wood trees?
Well, I mean, you know, we looked at hundreds and hundreds of woods, and we've analyzed all the woods from the site, so we know what woods that they were bringing in. Now, there is an example. They were bringing in pine. And there's evidence from other sites that the Maya actually made a trade in pine. The thing about pine is if you carbonize it, if you turn it into charcoal, it suddenly becomes very light. So you can carry that a long way, and that's, in fact, that's what they were doing. Now, I didn't point that out, just didn't have time, but that's actually a good point, that they were bringing in pine, so that there was some trade in pine. It wasn't just what they were producing. They were bringing in some pine. So they were stressed on the wood front. But, and they were, I think, coping with that by importing some pine. I think I'm over my time now, so thank you very much.